Zionism. Zionism, I think that's how Americans say it. I've been planning to make this video about Zionism for a while now, but since now the most popular sports in universities in the United States, in most campuses, is to hunt down Zionists, I think it's perfect timing. I actually have a whole research paper, like 20, 30 pages, I don't remember how many, that I had to commit for history class in high school. Looking back, I don't know why we had to do such a grandiose research paper for history class in high school. But the topic I chose is anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. OMG, look at that beautiful map I found, a very cool interactive map that shows kind of incidents that happened in US University. Now listen up. This is a map from 2017. Those are incidents that happened between 2015 and 2017. Now let's start at the top left. The anti-Semitism tracker map, which details all types of anti-Semitic incidents that occurred in U.S. college and university campuses between 2015 and 2017. The swastika tracker map, in the next one, top right, documents all the swastikas and graffiti signs, posters, or letters found on campus between 2015 and 2017. I think I'll stop saying that, it's the same. Oh no, it changes later. Here are what those posters, letters, signs, graffitis call for. The killing of Jews. Surprise. So a beautiful combination of gas the Jews, Jews die, and swastikas. Now let's go to the anti-Zionism area, thus the bottom two. So we actually have at the bottom left, it's a BDS scorecard map, which depicts the voting results of campus BDS resolution from 2012 to 2017. BDS is a movement that is anti-Zionist in nature. It is against Israel. And then at the bottom right, we have the academic boycott map, which is comprised of faculty members who have signed one or more public documents endorsing an academic boycott of Israel. This map also contains subdivisions that calculate the number of faculty boycotters per school. I don't know, you guys. Is it just me? Am I imagining things? Must be random, completely random. This is something that bothered me even in high school, where I sensed that it's the same thing, mostly because as a child I used to be a lot abroad, and it was pretty often that anti-Zionism or people who criticize the state of Israel, after a few questions, they just moved to complete anti-Semitism super quickly. I was smart, I just knew what to ask, and it's incredible how fast they went from anti-Israel and anti-Zionism to just being anti-Semitic. So I decided to make my thesis research for high school, for history class about that topic, and I really wish I could find it. I'll try to look it up again later. But this is not what the video is about. I'm actually gonna talk about real Zionism, what that means and what it is. So why was it so hard for Jews to return to Israel? First of all, a lot of the land in Israel was damaged by fire. There were almost no trees. All the trees that are now in Israel, all the forests, were actually planted by the Zionist movement. They were planted by the Jews. The land of Israel, the Romans burned it, the Byzantines burned it, everybody came over, the Muslims burned it, everybody that conquered it, they didn't care about it, they burnt it. So the land was barren. And all the forests we have now in Israel, everything that's green now in Israel, that's because the Jews did it. That's the Zionist movement that did it. Jews could not have returned to the land of Israel to establish the Jewish presence in the land of Israel because the situation here in the land of Israel was extremely difficult and extremely harsh. And every time Jews settled here, they would get expelled by different forces. It wasn't until the end of the 19th century that the Jews have decided all together that if they are all going to do it at the same time, this is how they could actually make it happen, because there would be enough people and big enough force to actually have that state. And with everybody working together, whether it's on the technical purchasing land aspect, you have all the Rothschilds and the rich people helping to purchase lands. So you have the rich class joining in, and then you have the farmers, the people coming in to work the land joining in, and you have the first Aliyah. It was Jews from Iraq, mostly Eastern Europe, and Yemen that came to settle Israel. It was a whole encompassing everywhere, Jews from everywhere, and all sorts, like the rich to the poor, that have decided to collaborate, to talk to the British Empire, to talk to the Sultan in Ottoman Empire, to actually make it happen. And this is what's so amazing about the Zionist movement, is that until now it was a group of people, or like several individuals, that would move to Israel. But the establishment of the Zionist movement had marked a turning point where Jews all over the world collaborate to make sure that the Jews that move there can actually establish a home, not die and basically get exterminated again, because this is what usually happened every time they try to do that. You come and you get exterminated or exiled or butchered or just live in awful poverty and as a dhimmi in awful conditions where you are not even allowed to pray. And that thing of gathering all the Jews in the world and working together, this is the incredible thing that is the Zionist movement. Okay, I'm gonna read the description of what Zionism is according to Wikipedia. Mind you, the same Wikipedia that thinks that there is barely any forced conversion in Islam and it's not part of the religion, so take it with a grain of salt. So here what it says. Zionism is a nationalist movement that emerged in late modern Europe in the 19th century to enable the establishment of a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine, a region roughly corresponding to the land of Israel in Jewish tradition. Following the establishment of the modern state of Israel, Zionism became an ideology that supports the development and protection of the state of Israel as a Jewish state. I'm not gonna lie, the English article in Wikipedia about Zionism makes me sick to my stomach, and like the way they word everything, you can see the hate behind this article. Zionism initially emerged in Central and Eastern Europe as a national revival movement in the late 19th century, both in reaction to newer waves of anti-Semitism and as a consequences of the Haskalah, or Jewish Enlightenment. Oh yeah, the Jews in Europe decided one day to go back to Israel based on absolutely nothing, some strand of something like a thin line of connection they had to the land, and it's not that they've been returning to this land for centuries. Like every century they would try to return to this land, to Zion, and then get kicked out by other forces like the Ottomans. To be honest, I don't know how, after how many words in this article, they even bothered to mention that the Zionist movement that we know today is just modern Zionism, but Zionism is deeply entrenched in Jewish tradition. So Zionism is just the modern version of it. The Jews were trying to go back to Israel for years and years. The term Zionism as is modern, but it's based on Shivat Zion. And by the way, Zion is another name for Jerusalem, to make that part clear. And this is something that's written in the Bible, and the thing that praying to the return to Jerusalem and to reestablishment of the state of Israel is a constant prayer and a constant wish in Jewish tradition. The saying next year in Jerusalem is something that you say every year in the end of Yom Kippur and also in the Leil Seder in Passover next year in Jerusalem. And now that we are in Jerusalem, Lashana Haba B'Yerushalayim Habnuya, it says next year in rebuilt Jerusalem. So just because the word Zionism wasn't used doesn't mean that Zionism didn't exist before that. It just was based more on religious sentiment and not necessarily modern national sentiment, because only in the late 19th century there was this revitalization of national sentiments all over the world, and nationality became a thing. Before that, it was a lot of, empires, kingdoms, and suddenly this whole thing of nationalities and trying to claim independence for different nations became a thing. And Zionism is part of that general movement of nationalism. Before that, there was just this classical Jewish nationalism and classical wish of returning to Jerusalem and returning to the land of Israel that the Jews always had. From 1897 to 1948, the primary goal of Zionist movement was to establish the basis of Jewish homeland in Palestine, as if there was a Palestine, as if something like that existed. There was no Palestine. Okay, I'll tell you what's bothering me, because an Israeli or a Jew who reads this article might not be alerted, but I know that Westerns are not aware of certain facts that I want to make clear. So I want to make clear what this terminology means. So Palestine is how Israelis, how Jews, to be exact, named the region that is the land of Israel. Even though the Ottoman Empire ruled the area, they still call it Palestina. Palestine. In Hebrew, it's clear that it's not the same Palestine, because the Arabs cannot say P, they say Palestine, so it's not the same thing. Palestina and Palestine, it doesn't sound the same, so in Hebrew it's easy to understand what's the terminology here. But in English, I know it's manipulating the crowd because they don't know what is the meaning behind it. So it wasn't called Palestina, a swipe of land was not called that. It was called Palestina by the Jews, and it was called the Mandate of Palestine because this is the land that was promised to the Jews. So they meant the land of Israel, and then they used the Roman name just out of habit. The Palestine thing didn't exist. It didn't exist. It's 100% correspondent with the land of Israel. It's the same thing, Palestina. It has nothing to do with modern Palestine. And I know that the way it is written here, a region roughly corresponding to the land of Israel in Jewish tradition, is a manipulation for Westerners who don't know what's the meaning behind it. It's in the 1880s, I think, that the Ottoman Empire noticed that the Jews are trying to go back to Jerusalem, and they have decided to restrict the possibility of the immigration to the land of Israel for the Jews. It actually said in the statement that the Jews are welcome to reside wherever they want in the Ottoman Empire, except for the land of Israel. Okay, so the official message from the Ottoman Empire, from the Turkish Imperatorian, I don't know what that means, was published in 1882, while the term Zionism in its modern use was coined in 1890. So here are the general points I want to talk about. First, how tarnished the land of Israel was, and from what exactly. I mean, there is a list of reasons. Second is the situation of Jews around the world that made them decide that it's time to establish the state in the state of Israel. Jews returning to Israel before the modern Zionist movement, some stories from there. Fourth, what the Jews did at the land of Israel to make it inhabitable. Fifth is different Zionist movements, different types of Zionism. Sixth, the contributions of the state of Israel. What does it mean to be a Zionist today? Seventh, the story, my family story, my own Zionist story, how we decided to move to Israel. And last, anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism in Judaism specifically, and maybe a little bit outside of the Jewish community. So I think I touched on it on the opening part, but here is the situation of the land of Israel. It was burnt down, and then it was conquered by the Arabs and by Mamluks and by the Ottomans and by the Crusaders, not in that order, I was just saying. Lots and lots of fighting for Jerusalem. But the truth is that other than the large cities, everything else around was tarnished every time. And the country had lots of diseases spreading, and everybody that were living in the land of Israel were mostly living inside very, very cramped cities, because everything outside the city was completely open for Bedouin tribes and looting. And so the city also was a place where you could somehow stay safe from just nomads going around and taking advantage of every village that they see on the way to try to rob it. But that's not it. It's not only that. There were also a lot of earthquakes. So, for example, in 1837, there was a huge earthquake that killed at least 2,400 Jews in Tzfat and Tveria, and thousands in general, so it seems. And also before that, for example, there was also a huge earthquake in the 8th century that the Jews in Israel wrote about. So there are Jewish writings from the 8th century that actually talk about the earthquake that happened there, and that many died, and that Jerusalem was ruined. And there are also a lot of archaeological proofs that there were quite a few earthquakes, and every time an earthquake happened, it ruined whole cities, and those residents of those cities had to flee. So the situation in the land of Israel was a situation where it was basically like the Wild West, but even worse maybe, because ironically, having Jerusalem made it more vulnerable to wars, religious wars that happened there. And there were a lot of genocides that happened on the land towards Christians, Jews, Samaritans. There were a lot of massacres that were happening in the land of Israel. It was not very unique to the land of Israel. It happened in a lot of places, but it happened in huge scales in the land of Israel in those 2,000 years that the Jews were officially in exile, even though there was a lot of Jewish communities and Jewish settlements still in Israel. And just I said, we have also the Jerusalem Talmud that was written in Jerusalem, in the land of Israel, mostly in Tveria, to be honest, in Tiberias. So until the 10th, 11th century or so, most Jews lived in the Middle East, and then the Arabs and the Muslims got a bit Muslimy and got rid of them, basically. So they moved to Europe. A lot of them had to flee towards the Christian countries. And then, of course, they got expelled from Christian countries too, and many things like that. But the land of Israel was always described as worse than almost anything else because it was so disease-ridden, ruined, looted, and the Ottoman Empire, of course, that is known for its human rights and never committed any atrocities or genocides. Like, don't ask the Greeks, the Armenians, the Assyrians. Don't ask them. The land of Israel was mostly empty. And then when the Jews started fixing everything up, when they started planting trees, drying the swamps up, when they fought against malaria, hundreds and thousands of Muslims from around Israel had two goals when they came. So some came because they wanted to oppose the possibility that the Jews will take over the Al-Aqsa Mosque, reclaim the Har HaBayit, the Jewish holy sites in Jerusalem. And the second and the most common probably reason for a lot of Arabs to move to Israel once the Jews started coming was because the Jews created work opportunities, got rid of the diseases, and started reworking the land so it can be less barren. Planting trees, redirecting water sources, rebuilding water canals, building roads. And a lot of Arabs were working at that. This is what they came for. But this video is not about them, all right? For that, I would say watch some other videos where I talk about it. The third thing that happened is that both the Ottomans and the Brits limited the migration of Jews to Israel, while the Arabs were allowed to come and live in the land of Israel without any limitations. And the Jews had to pay way more to purchase any land here, because what would usually happen is that the authorities or whoever an Arab gang was in power, like the Mufti of Jerusalem, some of the things that he did is that every person that sold property to Jews was declared as traitor and obviously tortured, killed, and everything like that. So instead, if somebody had to sell their property, they would be forced to sell it to the Mufti, and then that Mufti would somehow do the thing that everybody else were not allowed to and sell that land to the Jews twice, three, whatever times the price that the land was actually worth. I can show you a map. So here's a map of the Jewish settlement versus a map of malaria, the spread of malaria. The first people who came to live in Israel, you have to understand that Jews were not only allowed to purchase land basically in the malaria-infested areas of Israel. About half of them died of malaria. And for Jews to actually settle and resettle the land, they had to fight off malaria. So this is also one of the first things they've done, is to fight off malaria and to find a way to get rid of the swamps. One project, for example, that they did is bringing eucalyptus trees from Australia to dry up the swamps in Israel. That's how crazy the Zionist movement was. You have to understand, it was not something that maybe it could not have been done before the 19th century. The land required a lot of work to make it inhabitable. So throughout the years, you had those moments where you had massive returns, and massive, not like it was once the Zionist movement started, but before that, you'd have return of Jews to Jerusalem and Israel. Basically, every time that it was ruined, then the Jews would try to come back. When the Crusaders came and conquered the land from the Arabs. When the Crusaders came, the Jews actually joined them, some of them, and came back to the land to resettle it. Every time that the Jews could settle in Israel, they would, even though for most time it was very, very hard. And, you'd go back and a catastrophe would happen and they would scatter again and then come back and so on and so forth. For example, there are accounts from the 13th century, a lot from the 15th century when you had the expulsion of Jews from Spain. Some Jews came back. For example, there is one person that I want to bring up, Donna Grazia, who was expelled from Spain. She actually was a very rich businesswoman and she wanted to contribute to the resettlement of the land of Israel. I'm talking about the 16th century. She paid for yeshivas in Tiberias and she actually helped many people to come and resettle in the land of Israel. And she wanted to come herself, but she ended up dying on the way to Israel. She ended up dying in Constantinople, what is now Istanbul. During every century, you can find Jews that had done the Zionistic thing of coming and living in Israel. And a lot of them were for Hasidic, a lot of them were extremely religious. I really recommend watching the Ethiopian story of coming to Israel, for example, as they were not part of the Zionist movement, but they always had that dream that went from generation to generation to go back to Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. This is something that was always spoken and passed down. So when people came and said, hey, you can come to Jerusalem, they did it. Like they walked through the desert. They walked through. This is not the modern Zionistic movement. The modern Zionistic movement is establishing a modern country in this land of Israel. So you can see by saying the modern vision, why some sects in Judaism would not want the resettlement of Israel to be modern. They wouldn't want it to be nationalism like French nationalism or English nationalism. This is one reason, for example, to oppose Zionism, but I'll get back to that later. In the end of the 19th century, the anti-Jewish sentiment in what was back then the Russian Empire and the area that was known as Galicia, there were those huge pogroms that I think I read that all in all, they were responsible for the death of about 500,000 Jews, and the Jews were expelled from Moscow. So there was an urgent need for the Jews to find a home where they can defend themselves. And what was exceptional that at the same time, Jews from Western Europe, Western Jews, started to realize that even in Western Europe, Jews cannot live peacefully. And one person that is very, very famous is Herzl, who watched the Dreyfus trial and saw how an officer from the French army got humiliated for something he didn't do simply because he was Jewish. And this what woke Herzl up to understand that it's not only in Eastern Russia where Jews are being persecuted, but that in Western Europe and the Western world, the Jews are not safe in general. So I'm going to read some of the stated goals of the Zionist movement. Goal number 1, building a homeland to the Jewish people in the state of Israel, purchasing lands in the land of Israel, making them Jewish-owned, building an exemplary society based on social justice and equality, developing the land of Israel with Jewish workforce, preparing a diplomatic infrastructure in preparation for the establishment of a national Jewish entity in Israel, encouraging Jews to move to Israel and kibbutz galuyot, encouraging Jewish settlement in the state of Israel and bringing different diasporas together, bringing the Hebrew language back to life, Jewish solidarity and fighting anti-Semitism, building a Jewish force to defend the Jews from those who chase them, uniting the people of Israel, supporting the state of Israel, and more of the same, to be honest. The more I talk, the more I realize that this could be a really, really long video. So I think a lot of the ideas that I have and the topics that I want to talk about, I'm going to do it in other videos. So this one won't be too long. Let me run through everything. So I'm going to say everything pretty fast. For example, who are the non-Zionist Jews? Basically, it was the Bund, certain sects of the ultra-Orthodox community, and certain Jews that had their own reasons that later proved themselves to be not exactly the right direction to go to. So basically, the Bund, the communists. Communism is a global idea, everybody and everywhere. Why do you need to stick to a certain land? Unclear. Obviously, you cannot be a nationalist and a communist at the same time. So those were anti-Zionist Jews. Communist Jews are usually anti-Zionist Jews, even though there were some socialist communistic movements that were also Zionist, aka check out the kibbutzim. And they wanted to use the land of Israel to prove a point that you can actually establish communistic communes, kibbutzim, by the communistic ideals and then get something that's really workable. They ended up proving that indeed it can work when everything around you is capitalistic. Being a communist small community is something that is manageable. Long term, I can tell you that the kibbutzim, those who had great entrepreneurship and had really successful industries, went to be super, super rich, like all the members of the commune. But also, it's really hard to be accepted to those kibbutzim now. It takes years and years to become a member, even if you are married to one. And the kibbutzim that didn't have that entrepreneurial endeavor or some agricultural investment that they had ended up stopping being a kibbutz at some point. I want to say that I ended up mixing the who were the Zionists with the who were the anti-Zionists because they mirror each other. For example, you have your communistic kind of anti-Zionism, but there is also communistic social type of Zionism. You have the regular mainstream, modern kind of Jew Zionist versus anti-Zionist. So the Zionist, this is what the Herzl type movement. So you have the modern Jews that want to resettle the land. But the anti-Zionist version of that were Jews that, for example, were afraid that if they established the state of Israel, then they'd be kicked out of their own countries and they won't be able to stay in their wherever they were, right? If it was in Iraq or in India or in the West, wherever their business was. The other fear was that if we establish the state of Israel, then those Jews would get kicked out of the other lands under the claim that, hey, you have a state now, you have to leave. Those who lived in Arab countries were pogromed and then expelled. A lot of European countries, Jews that lived in European countries were just genocided and expelled. I have to say, like, this is something that people don't understand. Go back to Poland. When Jews that experienced the death camps came back to where their houses were in Poland, more often than not, they were murdered by the Polish people that were their neighbors because they didn't want to give them back their property. They tried to go back home from the death camps to where they used to live just to find that the local population is happy to help to finish up the job that Hitler didn't finish. Kind of like now, a lot of Europeans and a lot of people say that too bad that Hitler didn't finish his job. But that was true even in 1945, 46. There was never a moment that the Jews were safe anywhere, maybe except for the United States for a little bit, but they were treated as second class. And this is also the other aspect of the Zionist, modern Zionist movement, is the humiliation. So a lot of Jews, American Jews, for example, before the establishment of the State of Israel, helped Israel by smuggling guns and ammunition from the US to Israel, even though they were risking arrest and their lives and jail time and whatever, because they said, unless we have a country, even in America, we won't be treated equally. Because Jews, even though they are so productive in American society and they contribute so much to it, they're still being treated, and I saw the records, they were treated basically, I want to say like dogs, but I guess the more accurate description would be like the Negroes. There is a reason why the Jews and the Black community were marching together for civil rights. It's not talked about much, but the Jews wanted this kind of emancipation almost just as much as the Black people wanted it. I can tell you that before October 7th, when I was traveling in South America, I met an American guy and I told him that the anti-Semitism in the US is really, really profound. And he was like, no way. There is no way there is so much anti-Semitism. There is so much more like racism or... I'm like, no, I'm telling you for sure. And then I pulled up the numbers that proved that Jews are the most attacked minorities. And he was like, he wouldn't believe me. And I was like, well, Jews look like everyone else, so how would you know? And I'm like, okay, first of all, a lot of Jews are mixed right now. So just because they have a little bit of Jews in them, then they pull it out whenever it's comfortable. But I can tell you that those who are clearly Jewish, those who have any kind of Israeli background, I heard of a lot of discrimination that's happening in the United States towards them. And not just now, and not only in universities, also 20 years ago, and also my own experience and things like that. And it was so unreported or ignored that it was really under the radar. Nobody knew that there is an anti-Semitism problem in the United States. And even when I said it, people didn't really believe me. And that was the worst I told you so in my life. What's happening now, it's the worst I told you so that I could have asked for. Okay, so Zionism, like Herzl's Zionism and people like that were super integrated, super moderns felt that humiliation and felt that thing that no matter what they do, their Jewishness will hunt them. That really drove the modern Zionistic movement and the more secular type of Zionism, even though when it comes to the actual people that moved the Zionist movement, it was less of them, because those are usually those who were sitting well and were having like high regarded professions and money. Why go and die of malaria? Because this is what happened to the most of the Jews who tried to resettle Israel. They just died. The statistics were awful, but they did contribute with funds, and that is a lot. And by the way, this is also why they supported the notion that Israel should be established by an agreement from the world, like when all the countries agree that Israel should be established, because the situation in Israel was so bad. They wanted to actually prepare the ground ahead of time before they move there, right? Because in their minds, they're like, we cannot move to this desert, barren land, us rich, Western, whatever, good-looking Jews. Not all of them were Western, but you know, they had a certain lifestyle, and Israel at the time did not provide the lifestyle they were looking for. So it made a lot more sense to just buy the land, have the international agreement that the Jewish state needs to be established, and the more pragmatic type of Zionism was the more Eastern European Zionism, where it's like, you know what, it's malaria or pogrom. I mean, in Israel, we also suffer from pogroms, but at least if we go all together and we're going to be in one place, we can have some sort of a system where we can defend ourselves. And that's better than a system where we're so far from each other that we have no way of defending ourselves. So that's a more practical type of Zionism. And I'm actually mixed the three things. I thought I'm going to just mix the type of people, like the Zionist and the anti-Zionist example of the same kind of people. Like I said, there were anti-Zionist communists and Zionist communists that wanted to prove the concept of communism through the land of Israel, to prove that you can have this great equality and social justice through the land of Israel. The principles that the Zionistic principles that Israel was established on is basically taking from every sect of Judaism and the Jews, taking the things that they cannot compromise on and then just putting up them all up together at the same time and saying, we'll find a way to have a Jewish state that is also built on social justice and equality principles and equality between different people. At the same time, it's going to be modern, and we're going to have universities, and it's going to be scientific, and it's going to be secular and Jewish at the same time. It's going to be democratic and Jewish. So all those principles, every group who says, like, those are my principles, it has to be Jewish. Okay. It has to be equality and social justice. Okay. To, you know, and then it has to be modern and scientific. All right. And democratic. Somehow Israel is such a crazy place that it really makes it work, even though there is always like to redraw the agreed upon, like, you know, like the Sabbath laws. So one thing is like, okay, at least this is something that the socialists should be agreeing with the Jews, that there should be a day where somebody doesn't work. I mean, religious Jews. But then you have the secular Jews that want to party on Saturday too. So what happens on Saturday? So you have this very interesting kind of compromises that take all those three principles, where you can party on Saturday, but at the same time not work in Saturday, and secure social rights to the workers. Those who work in Saturday make twice as much as those who work on any other day of the week. And you minimize the amount of work that is done on Saturday because you want to respect the Jewish nature of the country. I mean, how did that's like we sometimes laugh and say the only way you can make all those different ways of thinking work together is when all people that live here have basically agreed that they literally have no other choice but to get along with each other, which is why part of the Jewish principle, the Zionist principle, is also unity and solidarity and uniting to fight against anti-Semitism. This is also part of the goals of Zionism. And then you have the ultra-Orthodox. So I know there is a lot of people who know of Neturei Karta. You'd be surprised, the super ultra-Orthodox Jews that are called Neturei Karta that march with Palestinians. They also, yes, they have a big community in New York, but the other big community that they have is here in Jerusalem. They do believe that Jews should be living in the land of Israel, but there is split, okay? So the split between the religious Jews. Some religious Jews believe that first you have to have the Messiah and then live in Israel as a self-governing entity. And they believe that if the Jews are appointing themselves to be self-governant, like having self-governance, that would mean that the Messiah would never come. This is why they oppose the state of Israel so much, not because they love the Palestinians, but they believe that Jews should wait for salvation before they establish a state, and that the establishment of the state of Israel is what pushing the salvation farther away, versus Zionist ultra-Orthodox that believe that by establishing the state of Israel, the religious Zionism movement, they've done it, and they do it out of complete belief that this is the right thing to do, and not just because there are other forces that force us to live here. Most Israelis today are more, even though they are not very aware of it, because a lot of us still see ourselves as very secular, those who were establishing the Zionist movement were probably even more secular than a lot of Jews that live in Israel, in a sense that they felt like they already belong somewhere else. Whereas Israelis, they have nowhere else to go. This is our home. So we don't have another loyalty to any other place. Like, we are not French Jews that also have some loyalty towards the French country or France in general. We only have one loyalty, and that is Israel, entrenched right now than it was when it started. You can see that the different types of Zionism and the different types of Zionist Jew versus anti-Zionist Jews are just a coin and then two sides of the same coin. So how did the Zionist movement look like in practicality? Of course, if you have a bunch of Jews that want to establish a state, the first thing that you have to build, universities and yeshivas, places to study, because there are Jews we are talking about. So it's always starting with the yeshivas. People who come to Israel are usually establishing a place that you study. Either you study Judaism or you study science. So this is a modern Zionist movement that we are talking about. So they indeed were very worried about the lack of universities in the land of Israel. And those are one of the very first things that they started working on. And I think the first university that was established in the land of Israel is the technological university called the Technion, where I studied. Actually, I did my computer engineering degree there. They started building the university in 1912. And the second thing I want to say that this is the first time where the actual language war was like full force, when they tried to decide what language to use to teach in that university, in the technical university that they built. So it's fun fact. So they started with a technical university because apparently Jews weren't allowed to study technical subjects in many places around the world. So this is why they really, really wanted to have an engineering school, because Jews weren't allowed to study engineering. And then they said, okay, how do we even bring teachers that would teach there? So the thought was to have the university operate in German, and that the study language would be German. And that started a whole debate. Eventually, German lost, and Hebrew was the language that was chosen. And by the way, the Hebrew revival story is another Zionist story that is crazy by itself, from a holy language to a spoken language. And that was a whole process that wasn't at all easy. But today, Israel and Israelis and a lot of other people around the world speak Hebrew. So they started building at 1912 and it really opened at 1924. Then next year was the university in Jerusalem, and then Tel Aviv only opened in 56. But before that, it was a lot of yeshivas, and opening a university in Israel was one of the goals of the Zionist movement. Interesting. The decision that opening a university in Israel is part of the Zionist vision. The proposal to do it was actually proposed in 1884. Another difficulty that anyone who knows what Israel looks like, even now, even though it's a lot harder to see, is that the agricultural endeavor in Israel wasn't easy at all, because there is not a lot of water here. And for example, in the areas around the Dead Sea, the ground is very salty, so it's really hard to grow crops there. Crops there. A lot of the Israeli invention, especially in the beginning, had to do with agriculture, like inventing an irrigation system that is it saves a lot of water, but is still very effective. And this irrigation system really changed the world of agriculture as we know it. It's called taftafot. If you look for it, you'll find it. It's an amazing water. The water technology in Israel is, I think, the most advanced in the world. That includes water recycling. And we also, of course, have desalination systems and things like that. But back then, the question of water was a real thing that people had to solve. And digging wells, searching for water, and building an irrigation system was a lot of the project that the Mobil Artzi, the water system from the Kinneret that runs through the entire country, was a huge project in Israel. And the invention of lots of agricultural techniques and things like that, because the Jews have a little bit of a trauma, just a tiny little bit, of getting ditched a lot. And they have decided that no matter what, we have to manage by ourselves. And that is also securing food, having a state that is high in food security. The downside of it is, of course, that everything is more expensive when you try to have as much as possible of ingrown things. But yeah, that's a whole thing that is also part of the Zionistic movement. And of course, the science and innovation, the high tech and things like that is more modern. Everything that is that sort of contribution is considered a Zionistic act by Jews. So everything that has to do with the developing the land of Israel, everything that has to do with innovation, everything that has to do with finding solutions to problems that are in Israel, that would all be considered, in Hebrew, we would call mifal tzioni, like we would say this is a Zionist industry, because you're developing the state, the country, the people. It doesn't have to do necessarily like with only Jews, right? At this point especially, and always. Since the establishment of Israel, Israel found itself being what it is meant to do, a refuge place and the homeland of Jews from wherever they were. Jews were rescued from Yemen, Jews were rescued from Iraq, Jews were rescued from so many different places. I might insert a clip from my anti-Semitism video here that talks about it. But Israel really proved itself necessary for saving the Jewish diaspora, because the Jews were in danger to get eliminated more than once, more than twice, more than thrice since the establishment of Israel. And right now we're seeing a situation that it might be that the Western Jews, whether it's the United States or Europe, especially Europe, might need a place to run to again, which is crazy. I don't believe for a moment that the fact that this Israel exists put the Jews in risk, but only the other way around. The fact that there wasn't an Israel made it a lot easier for massacres against the Jews to happen, because since the establishment of Israel, Israel stopped massacres, not only of Jews, to be honest, also stopped massacres from happening in Lebanon towards the Christian community, also stopped massacres from happening in Syria towards the Druze community, and it helped the Christians in Sudan to be able to defend themselves against the Muslims that massacred them by the millions, by the way. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, for sure. And throughout all this time, since the establishment of the State of Israel, Israel was fighting anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. In 1953, a miracle happened and Stalin got a stroke, because he was already planning to massacre all the Jews. And the USSR had done a lot of things. For one of them is to pass a resolution in the UN that Zionism is racism, which is just pure anti-Israel stance that they had to have. And they chased Jews who tried to move to Israel. This is something the USSR fought against, even though a few years prior to that, they wanted to massacre all the Jews. What's the logic there? Well, that's a different video. And that communistic fight against the State of Israel is something we see right now as well. This is why we have the Islamists and the communists join forces against the Israeli state. And the Arabs had declared a long time ago that they want to massacre all the Jews before the establishment of Israel. And during the partition plan and things like that, they have stated that they plan to massacre all the Jews that are in Israel because we dirty their Al-Aqsa Mosque. And there were many restrictions and still are, towards Jewish prayer in and around Al-Aqsa. Now Jews cannot pray in the upper area, but they can pray at the Western Wall, which they weren't allowed to. They were allowed, not allowed, depends on the niceness of the ruler. But the truth is that for Jewish survival, Israel is necessary, and Zionism is the reclaim of the Jewish land to the Jewish people. And until the establishment of the State of Israel, it was just part, and usually unloved, untouched, barren, poor, impoverished parts of different empires. And Israel, there was no any other state or entity that took the land and managed it as something that stands alone and a real government since the last time Israel existed. So it went from Israel, ruins, to Israel. And this is the indigenous people's right to reestablish and rebuild their country and have self-rule and self-governance in their homeland. Is the most natural, logical thing to do, so much so that when my parents were thinking whether to escape the USSR, whether to escape to the US or Israel, I think it was my father that said, we're not going from diaspora to diaspora, it's time for us to go back home. And we moved to Israel. And I grew up believing, and also I have no recollection or memories of living anywhere else. This is my homeland. This is my country. And this is something we are proud of. We took a barren land that suffered from earthquakes, lootings, nomadic tribes that would just come and loot and endless wars, trees burning, burned all the trees, ruined their, and then you also have, of course, the sheep that graze, but long term they ruin the ground and make it even more barren. And basically, we reclaimed this barren land that suffered all of that and turned it to the milk and honey land type of place as it was described in the Bible. And this is the most Zionistic thing you can do. And just like we have the super socialist communistic Jews and the super ultra religious Jews and the secular Jews and different types of Jews and Jews from Yemen and Jews from Ethiopia and Iraq and Russia and local Jews all living together and creating this super interesting, beautiful mosaic of culture, of innovation, of entrepreneurship, a real beacon of Western democratic ideals and morals that a lot of them are actually Jewish ideals and morals. In a way, this is the only way a Jewish state can be. And with that, of course, we can live with anyone, be they Christians or Druze or Bedouins or Arabs, whoever wants to come and make this country and better, those who are willing to work together and respect the democratic Jewish values that are basically the same values. And hopefully we'll find peace here in this land. And I really wish for Jews to be able to pray wherever they want in the land of Israel, and that we all would have equal opportunities, no matter the race or ethnicity. Those things don't matter. What matters are the values. This is what matters. And everything else is just noise. Well, happy birthday, Mom. Like, comment, subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. Happy birthday, Mom. I have a Buy Me Coffee in the description below. It really, really helps. I appreciate it. And thank you so much. See ya. This video is dedicated to my mom. It's my mom's birthday, so happy birthday, Mom. She was born in May 1st, which is also known as a communist holiday that we celebrate every year, and we celebrate it, and we don't like communism at all, but we have even a better holiday than any communist can imagine, and that is my mom's birthday.